everybody. Welcome to A Drink with the Idler again. I can see lots of old friends. We've got some retreaters, some Idler subscribers. Hi, you can unmute and say hi. We love a noisy hello at the beginning. Hello. Hello. Oh, everybody.
Hello. Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Brilliant. Look, we've got
wow.
hundreds of people this week for David Graeber. So I'm going to ask you to unmute in a second. Welcome everybody. Welcome anybody who's new to A Drink with the Idler. This is Victoria Hull here. I'm a director of programming at the Idler Academy. We've got the Idler magazine editor Tom Hodgkinson and resident philosopher Mark Vernon, who comes every week with wisdom and comment on the last week. So a very special welcome to our guests, and especially our special guest, lots of specials for David Graeber, our anthropologist, who Tom will be interviewing in a minute, and he'll introduce properly. But I'm just going to tell you a little bit about... I think it's time to unmute everybody now. I mean, everybody mute now. So all audience, if you could mute now, I'll talk you through how the hour is going to go. In a minute, we'll go straight to Mark Vernon for some philosophy. Then Tom and David Graeber will be in conversation for about 20-25 minutes. And then it's over to you. We might have a little bit more from Mark. And it's over to you to ask questions. It's a really important part of the session. And if you want to ask a question, please open the chat and direct message me, Victoria Hull, and I will pick out some of the questions and ask you to unmute at the end and ask your question live. So do direct message me, and I'm really sorry if I can't fit in all the questions, but send them to me and I'll be choosing some of you for the Q&A at the end. So we'll be getting going. Welcome to everybody. Over to you, Mark.
Thanks very much. Nice to say hello. I missed last week because I was out of town. I took this chance to leave London, where I live, to get into a bit of countryside with the easing of the lockdown. And it's partly that I wanted to talk about this week, actually. So for those of you who live in the countryside, you must forgive the slightly romantic city dweller stepping into the countryside feel to what I have to say. But it also, I hope, resonates with what David and Tom will talk about. Because I have this sense too, particularly with coming back, that, work life is really imposing itself again. Not just in the sense that people work, and of course people have been working all the way through the lockdown, and maybe people have wanted to work all the way through the lockdown as well, but this more collective sense, that getting to work, finding the time for work, trying to find work, supporting work, all that sort of presence is very palpable again, I think, now. And it's not all bad, don't get me wrong, but it's worth thinking about, as I hope Tom and David will be thinking about. I'm sure they will. But I thought I could offer something, and hopefully it'll resonate with what they say, by thinking about time, actually. Because I think one of the things that work and the modern work life does to us is it profoundly shapes our experience of time. And when I was coming back into London, and I live in South London, and so always kind of call upon the presence of William Blake when I feel in times of kind of, tension, claustrophobia, frustration, like the modern world isn't quite offering me everything I hope for from life. I try and call on William Blake. And he's so interesting about time because he thought that we can experience actually very different kinds of time. And that with a bit of imagination, we can free ourselves from the dominant modality of time, which is this work time, I think, now. He called this work time, Ulro, U-L-R-O, and its symbol for him was the chain, the symbol of the chain. And he liked the idea that this kind of time, this work time, is symbolized by the chain, both because it tends to enslave us, it tends to dictate life to us by its own will, but also because it's a motion of time that is connected like links in a chain. You know, it's cause effect, it's do this, that happens, it's put that much time in, you get this much money back in work. It's a very kind of mechanical notion of time. He associated it very much, and I think this is really true, with the invention of the clock. I'm very fascinated by clocks because I remember reading once how one of the things that really freaked people out about mechanical clocks was that they watched the pendulum swinging. And it had never occurred to people before that time might be a thing unto itself, its own kind of microcosm, because the experience of time before had always been associated with great forces, you know, like the heavens, like the planets, like the sun, that were massive, that were infinite, that reached to eternity. And now here was this device that somehow seemed to be controlling time, even with the swing of its pendulum. It was a self-contained kind of unit. It was fed by gravity, which in the pre-modern world was that which kind of held you down. It dragged you to the lowest point, rather than levity, which when you saw time in the heavens, helped you to rise expansively towards infinity. So, you know, so this kind of work time, Blake really got onto it for all these reasons about chains, about dragging you down. You know, it has a kind of upside, which I think makes it appealing as well, because if it's constrained, it also can feel safe. You know, it's like time that's going to tell you what to do, where you can feel productive, where you don't get bored, where you can focus on your own life. You know, the mechanical world has its profound appeals, and we shouldn't minimize that, because I think ultimately it does help people to feel safe, like they're really doing something. But it has these constraints for Blake. He moved into his second kind of time, which he associated with what he called generation. And this is the kind of time which is more cyclical. It's about the seasons. Its symbol perhaps was the circle. It's also, you know, the cycles of nature clearly. You know, when you look at the great trees in London, the plane trees, maybe you feel that they're living by a slightly different kind of time, both because they live by the great cycles of the seasons, but also, you know, they may be very much older than we are. They live for hundreds of years. And when you think about that, you wonder what kind of experience of that much longer period of time they might have. How is it written into their bodies, into their bark and trunks and leaves and branches and so on? So it encourages us to have a slightly longer view of time. You know, we think perhaps that we have ancestors, and then we think, what will it be when we become ancestors? What world will we have bequeathed? So you can feel it kind of stretching time a bit, this notion of generation time. So it's not just kind of clock time in the moment, what you're getting here and now, the chain feel. It's got a bit more of an expansive sense. And so Blake encouraged us to think about nature, to enter generation time, but he thought it didn't stop there. And the third kind of time that he asked us to contemplate was what he called Beulah time. And this is the kind of time which we experience. I don't know, when you say that was a wonderful moment, it's a bit more, in the Greek, they call it the kairos time rather than the chronos time. So this is the time that has a kind of quality all of its own. You know, we associate it, I think, with love and with highs, with romance, with bliss. You know, it's when you love to be with someone. I don't know, maybe these idler hours have even been a kind of time out of the rest of time as they've become over these weeks. You know, I look forward to them. They feel like they offer a moment in the week. And that's more like Beulah time. It's a meaningful time, put it like that. I think it's a time also where you can let go a bit. You know, it's no coincidence that we say, come and have a drink with the idler. You know, we kind of let go a bit. Perhaps the time that we need every day is when we go to sleep. And if you find it hard to go to sleep, one way of understanding that is because it's hard to enter into this Beulah time where you can just let go, where you don't have to worry, you don't have to think about what's coming up. You know, you can rest, you might say, in life itself a bit in this Beulah time. I don't know, you feel it perhaps also when there's exchanges of kindness, of real meeting, seeing a friend again. You know, I left London and saw people face to face last week for the first time, and there was that moment of actually seeing each other eye to eye, literally, and it was a wonderful moment where we remembered that we lived in a kind of embodied life, not just a life that had been so mediated as it has been in recent weeks. So there's Beulah time as well. But then the fourth time that Blake really encouraged us to try and reach towards, if possible, is what he called eternity. It's not eternity as in going on and on and on forever. It's not timelessness in that sense. It's much more about being able to see in the round. It's the whole of life. The symbol for him of that was the sunrise, eternity's sunrise. And I think the point about the sunrise is it's just like that moment just before it bursts over the horizon. And it's like everything is pregnant in that moment. Everything is full of possibility and potential. You know, it is light, but it's not the kind of direct light of the day. It's that pause where everything could be born and is born in eternity. It's the sense in the biblical phrase, in the beginning. It doesn't actually mean, you know, year zero, year dot. It means being in touch with the beginning as in the source, the wellspring, the origin of everything. That's eternity time. When you can experience that, you can actually move across different kinds of time, Blake argued. You can do the clock time when you need to. You can do the generation, the seasonal, cyclical time when you need to. You can do the blissed out, kairos, meaningful time as well. But you're not trapped by any one of them. You're not yearning for one more than the other. You can kind of rest in the source of eternity. And that's why in one of his best known phrases about time, he said, eternity is in love with the productions of time. Eternity actually loves all these different kinds of time because it can give them all a place. And it can offer a kind of movement between them. It can see the meaning, it can see the production, it can see the value, but it can flow and feel free of all that as well. And you know, maybe this is when time feels to us as a kind of energy. It's the energy of existence itself. It's when we love life because we feel it can give us more and more and more. So that time as eternity is a good thing. When you notice it, try and remember it, try and sort of be aware of it. And I think, you know, that's part of what Blake's huge value to us is that he almost gives us these different descriptions of, say, time, as I've been talking about, so that we can even notice when we're in different kinds of time. And so we can cultivate and foster the ones that really matter, the eternity, the Beulah, as well as the generation and the all-row. And maybe that's really important now because this all-row clock time is really pressing in big time now. And we need to hold the imaginative space to feel these different kinds of time as well. And as ever, idling is so important because it gives us the freedom to do so. That's one of the things which is so valuable about everything that the idler stands for. So dip into a bit of Blake. Remember all-row clock. Remember generation, season, cycle. Remember Beulah, the meaningful time, the moments. But more than anything, try and get that sense of eternity when you feel in touch with the source, in touch with the energy, that moment just before the sunrise. And I hope that might connect with the kind of things which, you know, power and motivate David's work and Tom too. But over to you.
Well, thank you, Mark. That's a lovely appreciation of Blake. And in fact, I remember reading a wonderful book called something like William Blake, Visionary Anarchist, when I was a teenager. And I found a copy the other day, and it's just said, this is a brilliant book written on it in pen. And, you know, there's something very anarchic about Blake's rejection as well of the Industrial Revolution, the mind-forged manacles and so on, and his kind of plea for some sort of human freedom, which would come from, you know, at least to an extent, disengaging yourself from what he called the system. Create your own system or be enslaved by another man's is one of his very inspiring comments. And to those of you who've just arrived or who haven't been to one of these before, thank you very much indeed for coming. And thank you to the regulars. My name is Tom Hodgkinson, and I'm editor of this magazine, The Idler. We're trying to bring idling back into everyday life and make it a respectable pastime. It's been more or less rejected by the authorities for at least 200 or 300 years. And we normally have a festival in the summer. The festival was, of course, cancelled, and we decided instead that we would start up these Zoom evenings where we get together with idols from around the world and chat to some of our favourite people. You just heard from the philosopher, Mark Vernon, and our guest today is the very brilliant anarchist and academic professor at LSE of anthropology, and also writer of some brilliant books which have found popularity, outside of the ivory tower, is David Graeber. Say hello, David. Have you unmuted yourself?
Yes, I have, as a matter of fact.
And what have you got to drink today? Because we're all having a drink, or some of us are having a drink.
I have a little cognac.
And that's a high quality cognac, because you don't agree with the cheap stuff.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's okay, cognac. I'm exploring it. I'm actually a strange thing I've just discovered. I used to think I just don't like to drink because I hate beer and wine. It just makes me vaguely sick. And only very late in life have I discovered that actually, no, I have extremely expensive taste, and I was always poor, so I never found out. So, yeah,
well, so
I like that.
Yeah. Well, so now you've risen up the ranks of academia, you've got a little bit more spare cash.
Yeah.
You've actually discovered that.
Chance to actually taste the things that I really
okay.
like.
So if anyone wants to sort of help David out, drop off some booze, but make sure it's extremely high quality. Let's talk about your as I mentioned, your different roles. You're a very unusual person because you come from a working class background in New York. You grew up in Manhattan, not born into any sort of privilege or anything. And then you became an academic. You came to London. You were a professor at Goldsmiths, and now at LSE, which, as I said, is a sort of training ground for the the young bankers of the world. But at the same time, you're an anarchist. You've popped up in Occupy movement, Extinction Rebellion, and so on. And you've also written these books, which we're going to come back to. Debt, the First 5,000 Years, which is a great title. It's a quite a hefty tome, a book about money and obviously debt and bullshit jobs, which is we interviewed you for in the Idler a couple of years ago. Are you sort of allowed to be an anarchist within the bosom of LSE? Not really. Yeah.
I mean, at LSE, yes. LSE, for some reason, hired me knowing exactly what they were getting. Yale hired me not really knowing what they were getting because, well, I mean, I don't know. Maybe I declared myself an anarchist. Maybe I hadn't. But nobody really cares what you say because when academics say this sort of thing, everybody assumes they're lying. You can say pretty much anything you want about who you are as long as you're willing to be a hypocrite about it. But the moment they discovered that I actually did do even a little bit of real anarchist stuff,
yeah,
slightly non-hypocritical, then
So what does anarchist stuff consist of for you? I mean, what do you actually? Well, we talked about this before. I mean, what's your definition? Because I mean, still today. Despite my best efforts, someone just mentioned Paul Lafargue in the chat. When I started the magazine, someone said, "Oh, well, you must be an anarchist." I said, "I hadn't really thought about it because there's this anarchist hostility to what they call wage slavery." How would you define anarchism?
I try to avoid doing so, but I imagine it's in that tradition which sees the state and capitalism as unnecessary and imagines a horizon where we would be free of those things. Imagines a truly free society would mean getting rid of all forms of power and domination entirely. So without prioritizing one over the other. But the state is in there. I mean, the state isn't, it's a very strong rejection of the principle that the ends justify the means. Instead, anarchism embraces the idea of direct action. And the idea of direct action, I always say, is the stubborn insistence on acting as if one is already free. As much as possible, we want to try to create and live as if we are living in a free society already. And it's up to them to stomp us down.
So that's a very positive attitude. It's a sort of state of mind as much as anything. I mean, are anarchists, there's that phrase in anarchism, that person's not really an anarchist, they're a sort of centralist trot, i.e., encapsulated in that is a sort of hostility to state socialism. Would you share that? I mean, if you,
Oh,
if you
yeah,
had to
horribly oppressive system, yeah. I mean, the state socialism as it has actually existed, and as you know, anarchists tend to be the first people who go up against the wall in societies like that. But it's based on a fundamental absurdity, which is that you can centralize power as a way of ultimately decentralizing power. State socialist societies claimed their ultimate aims were the same as anarchists. The dictatorship of the proletariat was a very intentional choice of phrase, because a dictator in ancient Rome was someone who was given power for a specific term of time. And he was given total power so as to change an emergency situation. And so the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat was that it was meant to be temporary. I've seen pictures of, my wife actually grew up in the Soviet Union. When she was young, they would have the pictures of young people saying, this child, when they're, when they're old, will be living under communism.
I've just
Communism
seen
is anarchism.
but anarchism is not, it doesn't, people think it means chaos. I mean, someone's just said, oh, well, you're talking about anarchy, but you started on time. Well, anarchists are perfectly entitled to be punctual.
Yeah, this is a common confusion, because people assume that anarchism, that essentially order and violence are the same thing, but they're actually the opposite. You only need to threaten people with weapons if you're bad at organizing. And that's what the state is. It's a bad form of organization. So I always say capitalism is just a bad way of organizing communism, because real, actual production is always cooperative. In a similar way, the state is a bad way of organizing people, because they wouldn't have to constantly threaten you with guns if they knew what they were doing.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And so the authorities at the LSE, they think that, they respect your, I mean, it's like William Godwin, isn't it? I mean, he was a sort of respected philosophical anarchist. He wrote books. He was Mary Shelley's father. And there's always room for, I suppose, a couple of them out there, Chomsky. And so you don't get any sort of...
about that, yeah. Am I getting the sort of like, look, we're fair, we have everybody kind of hat, but I'm willing to take that, I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, can I just ask you about debt? Now, why do you want to write a gigantic tome about debt and money?
Yes.
How does that sort of, is this part of the, is your book writing part of the, if you like, sort of political activism, or is it part of your academic studies?
It depends on which book. I mean, they're all a degree of both, right? I'm motivated by intellectual curiosity, but I'm also, I recognize that everything you do is a direct action of a sort. So I've had books that lean more one way. I wrote a book of Marshall Solins on divine kingship. It was not itself a political intervention. But the book on debt and the book on bullshit jobs, in a way they were. I see them very much as political books, because it has occurred to me that capitalism increasingly relies on moral arguments. That is to say, the traditional arguments for capitalism have largely gone by the boards. Generally speaking, there have been three historically. One is, well, maybe it creates terrible inequality, but even the people on the bottom can expect that their kids and grandchildren will be doing better than they. Nobody's really saying that anymore. Number two was, well, it'll create rapid technological advance, so what are we even arguing about? We're all going to be living on Mars in a few generations, and that seems to have dried up. And number three was stability. It creates a larger middle class, so we're going to have political stability and democracy, and so eventually, any other system will create chaos. Well, now we've got complete chaos coming out of the political systems of the most advanced capitalist countries. So you can't use any of those arguments anymore. So basically you have two left. One is like, there is no alternative. It's also North Korea.
Yeah, what about the argument that you hear a lot, which is that it's natural? It's natural for us to sort of behave like wolves and, sort of compete and kill each other.
Well, I mean, actually, I've just been going through the evidence from the Paleolithic on that one. That you should mention this, because I'm writing a book of an archaeologist right now. And there's actually, I think, 400 sites of human skeletons from the Paleolithic. In only 3 of those sites is there any sign that anybody was killed by violence. So no, actually. There's some people who think war was actually invented in 6000 BC. I don't think that's probably true. But that's how little evidence there is for violence for much of human history. Just to get back to the point about morality.
Yeah, sorry, the second one. Yeah.
I'm taking too long to make my points. There's the second one. So there's either us or North Korea is one, and the other one is moral. People really do believe that people who don't pay their debts are bad people. They feel morally, rich people do not feel morally obliged to pay their debts at all. But poor people really do, I mean, for the most part, especially people who are in the sort of lower middle class. I mean, they define themselves as their idea of responsibility is largely about paying debts. So to some degree, debt and morality become the same thing. We can't think about debt outside of terms of morality because our sense of what morality even is has been redefined in terms of that.
Well, didn't Nietzsche say that Gilder and debt and guilt are all sort of related terms?
Yeah, he did. And in German, should morality and debt are the same thing. In a lot of languages, I believe in Sanskrit and Aramaic, for example, the words for sin and debt are the same thing. So in the Lord's Prayer, when it says, forgive us our trespasses just as we forgive those who trespass against us, the word actually is in the original is debt. Forgive us our debts just as we forgive our debtors. But that's the joke. We don't forgive our debtors, do we? So why should God forgive us? There's a whole parable about this. So there's the debt morality and there's the work morality. So those are the two things that are really holding together financialized capitalism. People really do feel they should pay their debts, and people really do feel if you're not working harder than you want to be working at something you don't enjoy very much, preferably for a guy you don't like, then you're just a bad person and don't deserve the love and support of your community.
Now, in debt, I think you talk about the ban on usury that half existed in the Middle Ages up until the Reformation.
Oh, it did exist.
So that must have created a very different sort of feeling in society. You weren't allowed to charge interest on loans.
Absolutely, and they really did. That's why they had to invent mortgages and things like that. I'll pretend to buy your house and then rent it back to you, that kind of thing. As a way of getting around it. But those things were enforced, and in the Islamic world as well. And it was very radical. In a lot of ways, the Middle Ages comes out looking pretty good. When I started doing the long-term history in debt, you could see that money, big argument among monetary theorists, whether money is basically bullion, whether it's basically a commodity, gold and silver, used in exchange, or whether it's really a unit of account to measure debts. And it's always been both. And that's kind of what's confusing about money. Two sides of the coin, as the anthropologist Keith Hart puts it. But if you look over history, it kind of goes back and forth. Money starts as a credit system, and there's a period between maybe 600 BC and beginning of the Middle Ages where they're really using coins, and it becomes a physical thing. And that's a period of mass slavery, giant empires, very violent. A lot of the classical age was this incredibly bad period to be alive if you weren't lucky enough to be an Athenian or Roman citizen or something like that. Middle Ages, actually, it was a backlash against that. And they went back to credit. There's this whole idea of, people reverted to barter. That's not true at all. They were using money, they just weren't using physical money. In fact, for a long time, they were using Roman money. They just didn't have any. But they would, then they were using Carolingian money, which was never actually produced a lot of it. So they actually called it imaginary money. So there's the imaginary money you keep accounts in, and then there's the actual stuff that you kind of maybe use occasionally, but everything was on credit. But whenever you have a period where money is basically seen to be credit, it's a social relation. So you have to create some way to make sure that whoever has the means of creating credit doesn't enslave everybody else. This is the big point of the debt book, because in the Middle Ages, they did that. In earlier periods, there were debt jubilees. They would just simply wipe the slate clean periodically, like in ancient Mesopotamia. In the Middle Ages, they banned usury entirely, banned interest taking. Then they went back to gold and silver, went back to giant empires, went back to slavery. That's the period we're coming out of now. So a period of capitalism corresponds to a period where money is assumed to be.
Okay, so let's just talk. You just mentioned slavery. In my own reading of books, which is probably pretty sort of scanty, it looks like, under the Middle Ages, as well as usury being banned, actually the Christians were extremely anti-slavery.
They were.
It was seen as wrong. And then it starts coming back when after the Puritan Revolution, or at least I think it starts in sort of like early 1600s in Portugal. The idea that you can actually sort of go to Africa and
Well, they were doing it at first with people, actually they did it, sugar plantations, they were doing them in Cyprus and Crete and places like that, the Crusaders. And it was people from North Africa and Eastern Mediterranean, but also Slavs, that's why the word slave, right? There was a big argument about whether they should use slaves or not, and eventually they didn't. But the idea of setting up sugar plantations and then using forced labor, they started that in the Caribbean islands, and they moved to the Canary Islands, and then finally when they figured out how to get to America, they moved the operation over. But they never did it in Europe because there was such popular revulsion against the idea of keeping human beings as property, which is something interesting because the entire ancient world was totally based on slavery. And we talk about the decline and fall of the Roman Empire and, as this catastrophic, terrible thing. But, 40% of the population by some estimations were flat out slaves. I don't think it was so bad for them because actually, after about 300 years, suddenly there were no slaves.
Yeah. And
it was one of the great liberations of human history, and nobody talks about it as such.
The Middle Ages, they also brought out the good stuff about the classical period. I mean, they like the Stoics, and as our philosopher Mark Vernon will tell us. Can we move on to, we're rocking through, the idea of jobs, bullshit jobs. Again, how did the job, as we know it today, do you think, actually develop? Because it was a little bit different again. Work was differently organized in the Middle Ages.
Absolutely.
And then you sort of fast forward to now. I mean, can you sort of briefly sketch that change in work practices?
I've been actually doing some research on this recently on the law of work, which is very interesting because it's not contract law. Labor contracts don't come out of contract law, they come out of master-servant law. It used to be that wage labor did exist, especially in Northern Europe, but it was something you only do for a certain part of your life, essentially between the age of around 12, maybe 8, if you're like from certain families where they send the kids off to be craftsmen. But everybody.
We tried to do that with our kids, but it didn't really work out.
Yeah, England was always kind of notorious in the rest of Europe for trying to get rid of them really early. But they would send kids off, and then you only really become an adult when you're 30. So during that period, you would be working for somebody else as a servant, and everybody did that. And that's why you have ladies in waiting. Actually, the word waiter comes from lords who were like basically apprenticing to be lords. So like knights' pages, they'd go around carrying your sword or tidying up after you. And they were waiting for their inheritance. That's why they were called waiters. But they bring you your food. But everybody did it. Apprentices, farmers, servants and husbandry, milkmaids. That's what milkmaids were. So everybody did it, but they did it just to make enough money so they can set up and get married and start a real life. And what capitalism, is a very large percent of the population never get to grow up. Essentially, that's how it was first experienced. You could never become a master craftsman person. So you're permanently a servant. But the problem they had was that like people who were real wage laborers in the Middle Ages were actually doing pretty well because it was more like hiring a plumber than it was like employing somebody. They know how to do something you don't know how to do. So if you hire someone to fix your barrels or, whatever it is,
Cooper, or there was many specialists. I think there was something like 30 or 40 trade guilds in Florence in 1400 or whatever.
Exactly. And they all have their special knowledge and you can't give them orders because you're not one of them. In fact, to set up factories, one of the first things they had to do is break the guilds because only people who have done glass work and boss around glass makers and only people who've done iron work, so forth and so on.
Yeah, so it was like a union of bricklayers.
Absolutely. Yeah, the Masons, for example. That's the only one that's still around because it transformed. Another story, but so they're servants. But then there came the other problem. So once you can hire them, the other problem was debt actually, because technically you owe them. So in a master servant contract, they're the creditor because you only pay them later. So during most of that time, it's actually the boss who's the debtor, and the law was totally in favor of the creditor over the debtor. So they had to change that around. And that's why they had to set up factory stores and get workers into debt, because otherwise it would be the boss who was the creditor. And one of the ways that manifested itself was, since the boss owes you, and often it took them a long time to get enough cash because there wasn't much cash around to pay you, you got to take home stuff. So every occupation, you know, you would get to take home like chips. So if you're working with wood, any piece of wood under 3 feet long, you get to take home. So all of the dock lengths, you know, all the houses are made out of tiny, tiny little pieces of wood, because everybody just take home wood from work. But whatever you do, you're taking home stuff, because that's like interest payment on the debt that they owe you. And actually, to set up wage labor the way it is now, first of all, they had to create 9 to 5 hours so people couldn't steal stuff. The real reason for 9 to 5 was because they wanted to work when the sun was out so they could spy on them. And the other thing they did was they started creating, Jeremy Bentham, you've probably heard of the Panopticon.
Jeremy Bentham, the sort of founding father of utilitarianism. Everything can be measured.
Our enemy. Yes. Yeah, he's famous for having created this prison with a giant tower in the middle, but you never know whether there's somebody in there looking at you or not. There's these giant windows.
Sorry, David, can I just interrupt here?
His brother did that to stop people from stealing wood. That was how that was.
Okay, yeah. So it's the idea of spying on. Can I just? I've just got to address this thing, which always comes up when George Orwell had the same problem. When you say anything positive about the Middle Ages, someone says everyone died at 35. Can I just put that? Can I just put that myth to rest? And can you just tell us why that's not true?
No, a lot of people died when they were 2 or 3. That's very true. But if you made it to 35, you'd probably make it to 70. Yeah, there was basically, under traditional, forms of fertility, there's a lot of infant mortality, which is horrible, right? But, it meant that if you make it to 8, you'll probably survive, but a lot of children died. But then there's another hump where women would sometimes die in childbirth, or men could kill each other. So then there's another spate of mortality around 25. But if you make it to 35, you're probably home clear, or 40.
Yeah, and I mean the infant mortality rates go up and down. I mean, I think they went down in Victorian times actually, relatively recently they've been massively improved.
Yeah,
but until sort of relatively recently. So going into the modern job, then, how does the modern job emerge, and how does that turn into its more sophisticated later cousin, the bullshit job?
Yes. So that's a very interesting question. Most labor law came not from those kind of master-servant law, but through the sort of Bob Cratchit guys, the guys who are the clerks. And they actually started negotiating because they could do contracts and, could afford lawyers. And so all that stuff about benefits and vacations and all that was originally developed by those guys. And then, of course, trades unions. But the bullshit job is an interesting question. I mean, like, the point of a bullshit job is that it's supposed to be a real job. So one of the big transformations is that a lot of these sort of feudal retainer jobs are now actually supposed to be, you're supposed to pretend that you're really doing something all the time. So, if we're talking like Jane Austen period, everybody's got footmen. Footmen were supposed to be idle. In fact, they were probably doing more than they let on. They probably did employ them in secret, but they were supposed to be sitting around looking like they were doing nothing to show how important you are, right?
Yeah, okay. So the so it's the idea of footman. If you have a crowd of loafers around you,
right? Yeah, you can't be magnificent without an entourage, right?
Yeah, it's the entourage. It's like P. Diddy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, basic feudal system, of course, you're going to have lots of people sitting around doing nothing. And the less they do, the more important you obviously are. So technically, what footmen were actually for? They were supposed to check before the carriage for bumps on the road. But, in fact, they were probably washing dishes and, doing all sorts of stuff. But you're supposed to pretend they're just like, I have this guy to polish the doorknob. I have this
Well, so what you're leading up to is the modern corporation, unwittingly has recreated what is quite a sort of ancient idea that your importance depends on how many people you bring with you. I mean, I think I remember reading,
they call it managerial feudalism.
Yeah, like so. maybe not Beowulf, but something like that. When another warrior turns up, he arrived with 400 men, sort of thing.
Yeah, who are those guys? Right?
Yeah. So it's the same as in the corporation. Okay, so so that's why. Well, a bullshit job is not a badly paid job, is it? I mean, it could be quite comfortable.
Quite the opposite. I mean, you can have bullshit jobs that are badly paid. That's the worst option. But I often made the distinction between bullshit jobs and shit jobs. In a way, they're polar opposites. A shit job is just bad, bad conditions, don't get treated with respect, don't get paid much, it's hard work. But chances are that's necessary. I mean, there are shit jobs that are also just stupid, and that's horrible. But generally speaking, what bullshit jobs are office jobs where you're paid well, you're treated with respect, you put on a nice suit, you go in there, everybody in your family thinks you're the guy who made it, but secretly you're not doing anything. You're racked with this kind of deep inner horror.
Someone could say, how could I get a bullshit job? I mean,
it's not hard.
We did have someone who wrote a piece on the Idler blog saying, hey, what are you talking about? It's great having a job in a corporation. You just sort of go in, sit around all day, go home, do your own stuff and collect the salary. Well,
this is the interesting thing, right? Because I just figured, I mean, on the one hand, here I am coming from a working class background, and you'd think that the last person I'd want to sympathize with is somebody saying, oh, I don't have anything to do all day, they pay me like $80,000 a year. Yeah, but, feel my pain. But actually, I mean, I can kind of understand it, because the thing that surprises me, first of all, it shows how economic theory is just totally wrong as a theory of human nature. Because according to economic theory, which is, of course, the reigning theory of everything for the last 30 years, those guys should be happy as clams, right? Because, all human action is based on trying to get the most rewards for the least output of energy, resources, whatever it might be. Well, these are guys who are just sitting around and getting paid lots of money to do nothing all day. They should be like king of the world. But the amazing thing is just how miserable most of them are. I think when I did a survey of people, I asked people to send in accounts of their most pointless jobs. I have several hundred. I think like maybe 3 of them reported actually liking them. Maybe is a little bit more. Actually, there was one survey in Holland where they, I think 28, no, it's 37%, something like that. I'm making this up, but it was around there. Said that their jobs were pointless, but only 34% said they were unsatisfied. They didn't find them satisfying. They said, aha, so there's 3% of people who feel their jobs are pointless but satisfying. Why would that be? Maybe they hate their families, Yeah,
it's great to get away with it. It's satisfying just to sit there, not right. At home.
But in fact, they're quite unhappy. So there's the interesting question of what is it about us that we're not happy? The economists are wrong. People really do feel the need to feel they're contributing something to someone. So either if they think their job is not contributing to the enterprise, or the enterprise itself should not exist, then you get this kind of depression, anxiety, it's incredible, horrible sadomasochistic workplace dynamics, psychosomatic illness, all sorts of things start going wrong.
Okay, and what about bullshit jobs post-corona, post the virus? I mean, is there any sense in which the organizations on the one hand will think maybe we don't need all these people because we've sort of managed with furloughed workers. So whether you think that's good or bad, there's going to be a lot of redundancies, mainly bad, maybe quite good for some people to start a new, who knows. On the other hand, what about the furloughed workers who don't actually want to go back to the old ways?
Yeah, I mean, who are they making those decisions? Those guys are all been working from home too. And generally speaking, the way it works in corporations is that your importance, it really is very futile. Your importance in the corporation is measured by how many people you have working under you. There was this one guy who was a efficiency expert for a bank who wrote a long detail about this. He realized his own job was bullshit because he'd come up with ways that you could fire half the people in this department or 80% of the people in that department. They never do it. And you realize he was just there to have them pretend they were doing this. Because in every case, somebody would lose prestige. They wouldn't be as important if they didn't have as many people working under them. So those are the guys still making the decisions when you say them. I mean, you always have to remember when you say, why don't they? Who are they anyway?
Who are they? Yeah.
Yeah, it's like when they're saying, why don't they fire Dominic Cummings? Well, Dominic Cummings is them.
So if we just pinned it down to Dominic Cummings, he is them.
Right, yeah.
Now,
Same way in the corporation, them are not going to fire themselves.
now, we'll go to questions in just 1 or 2 minutes. But could I just ask you, from your observation, I try and figure out what's going on in the world by reading things like the FT, the Financial Times, which I don't really understand. And in there, they've been saying, it's a kind of a mystery in America that the economy seems to be collapsing, and people are out of work and so on. Coronavirus keeps kind of reappearing. But at the same time, people are going crazy for the stock market. The stock market's going up. The stock market is doing really well. I mean, what's going on? It doesn't, shouldn't there be a sort of stock market crash if the economy collapses?
Yeah, it's really interesting. There was a little bit for a while, and they were thinking of shutting down Wall Street. And I remember reading a whole debate about that. The thing that really struck me, in fact, in that debate was the fact that nobody, pro or con, actually said that shutting down Wall Street would actually harm anyone in any way. So what is the point of having Wall Street? It doesn't, it's good for itself. It's not good for anybody else. But that's exactly right. It is a predatory institution. And I think this shows really beautifully that, because someone who works at Wall Street explained this to me. He said, well, why is it when the economy crashes, the Dow goes up? Well, if the economy crashes, the guys who are going to shut are the little cafes, for example. The small shops. They're the one, the big gigantic corporations, not so much. What happens when the little cafes shut down? Well, Starbucks buys up the property. Well, those little cafes are not on the stock market. Starbucks is. So it's actually good for the kind of institutions that are represented on the stock market if everybody else suffers. There's a direct contradictory interest between us and them. And a lot of what has been going on for the last 40 years or so, since the 80s, has been to try to trick us into thinking that we're them, essentially. I noticed this in the media back in the 80s when I was very young, that I got to see the transition when all these newspapers sort of fired their labor reporters, and right around the same time, they started running the stock quotes like below the screen during news broadcasts, because anybody interested in world events will clearly be an investor in the stock market. And in fact, most people are not, even through their pension funds in any way, invested in this thing. But the idea is we all own a piece of this, and the way I put it is, it's almost as if they're trying to redefine freedom as owning a piece of your own perpetual subordination.
Yeah, that's right. A friend of mine said he went through a gambling phase, but he bought shares in William Hill because he said that every time he lost in gambling, at least maybe the share price would go up. I don't think the share price rise made up for his gambling debts, unfortunately. Well, that makes a lot of sense about the stock market. And also, I guess that, what I think could be really sad about this is that, all the small businesses, as you say, that are sort of collapsing and closing, where are they going to go? Amazon announced 100,000 new jobs, on the day of lockdown, pretty much, at the end of March or the beginning of April.
Amazon's so evil.
They're sort of hoovering everyone up, who has been sort of, who've been thrown out elsewhere or can't make it work as a freelancer. On the other hand, do you see any hope in a sort of resurgence of a new entrepreneurial stroke creative class?
I think it depends. I think that people have realized that, in a certain sense, social creativity in society is that which is taken away from them. People have spent a lot of time with, opportunity to read and learn about the world. That's why the very first thing that happened when they came out of lockdown is everybody, showed up for Black Lives Matter and came out in the streets. I think nothing terrifies the ruling class more than people having time to actually think of time, so I think something's going to happen. I really see this with young people. I went to a lot of the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, and these are the people who are going to be part of that new creative class, but they were all so young. I didn't see anybody I knew, which was kind of cool, because usually you go to demo, it's like, same old faces. And there were so many of them, and they were all really young. I got you're talking to people, I really got the sense that there's a whole generation that's just like absolutely livid at what they're being presented with. I mean, I'm not really the baby boom generation. I'm just after that, but those guys fucked up the world like you can't imagine. I mean, and you have these kids basically saying, all right, lockdown is just a kind of preview of what they had in store for us anyway, which is to like have all our major human relationships over screens and never actually meet anybody until we're supposed to sit here and like, sort of pretend to work and be isolated from each other until the seas boil and we all die. Yeah, thanks. No, the idea that society is the measure of that which has been taken away from us, and we just have to go out and recreate it. I think that process is going to happen. The form that it's going to take is something we can't entirely predict, but we should be here trying to support it in any way possible.
Well, let's do that. Victoria, should we go to some questions? Because we've only got about 10 minutes left.
Absolutely masses of questions. So please forgive us if we can't fit you all in. Could we start with Diana, who's just got a quick question?
Hello, this is for David. It was basically, if the state is bad.
Can we see you, Diana? No.
You can
no obligation.
Okay.
No.
That we should be on now. If the state is bad organization, what is good organization, and how do we manage society without a body that has the mandate from the rest of us?
Well, I mean, that really depends on how you define society. I mean, we have this idea that nation states are kind of a natural size, or to get to a certain level of organization, you're going to have something like that. But if you think about it, like nation states vary from anything from like Russia or China to Liechtenstein. They can be any size. I think that organization similarly, I define anarchist style organization as any form of organization which wouldn't require you to ultimately be able to pick up the phone and call somebody with a weapon to say, shut up, I don't care what you think. Any organization that wouldn't require that would be an anarchist form of organization in my mind. So it could look like a number of different things. So for example, anarchists have tended to use consensus decision-making rather than straight up and down 51-49 voting, because if you do voting, it tends to mean some people are angry losers and aren't going to want to go along, right? Whereas if you just hear everybody out and change the proposal around, you can usually come up with something everybody can at least live with. So it means radical decentralization, but at the same time, finding consensus among whatever group you are working in to make major decisions. There are people who lived like that for thousands of years. It's nothing, it's not rocket science. If you go, I lived in Madagascar, everybody does that all the time. That's not a problem for them. Everybody grows up learning how to do consensus process, so that's just what they do. So the state broke down in about 90% of the country for about 20 years, and nobody even knew because they just kept on going as they had before. I hope nobody figured it out.
So it's like you leave people alone and actually they get on with it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one of the things anarchists have to deal with all the time is this assumption, I mean, I know it's not what the question was, but I thought I'd throw this in, that, if there were no police, if there was no form of centralized violence, everybody would just start killing each other. It's like, well, actually, nobody thinks I would go out and kill people, but everybody thinks somebody else would, or everybody else. In fact, this can be tested. There have been times or places where police have disappeared. And even in modern cities, actually my favorite example, apparently at one point during World War II, the Nazis arrested the entire Amsterdam police force. And just took them all away. So there were just no police in Amsterdam for a year. And almost nothing changed. Yeah. I mean, property crime went up because there were professional burglars, but violent crime didn't change at all. So. Okay. Yeah, people don't actually need this stuff.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, David. Dominic Hills has got a question. This is quite about economics, I think. And David, you're not an economist, but Dominic, will you ask your question? You there, Dominic?
Dominic.
Hello.
Dominic Hills. Oh, here he is.
Great.
So
Hi, where are you?
the question goes back all the way back to the bit about debt. Yeah, that one.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So, so what I was thinking was debt start. So you've got Marx's value use thing, and then you got to Veblen and them lot with more symbolic.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And then I was wondering if we're now in a period of we're like debt pigs. We are being farmed for our ability to produce prime debt. So student debt would be a perfect example. It's a middle class debt that will last, 30 years, never get paid off.
Mm-hmm.
But we'll service it, and so it's valued as just for its purpose of being debt. So with your bullshit jobs, it's just things to service the debt.
It's an interesting thought. I mean, definitely it goes along with a financialized economy. And when we talk about finance, there's a lot of mumbo jumbo there. But finance just means other people's debts, right? Finance is just creating and manipulating and speculating on debt. So that's all it is. And generally speaking, debts can't be repaid or the economy would disappear. I always point out that, if you look at a, sorry about this. Stop. If you look at, there's the Queen. She's saying, "I promise to pay the bearer the sum of 20 pounds." So this is actually a debt owed by the Queen. It's not 20 pounds. It's a promise to pay 20 pounds, something the equivalent of 20 pounds, whether gold, silver, or tableware, whatever it might be. So that's what money is. And it's all based on a loan. A bunch of merchants made a loan to King William to fight a war, and he gave them the right to take that debt, which he owed them, it was 1.2 million, and loan it to other people in the form of banknotes. That's the Bank of England. If the Queen ever paid that debt, then there would be no money.
But we've created a new era of debt where there's much more debt than money. We owe trillions to Mars or something.
Yeah, well, that is owed to somebody.
I think that links to the next question. If we can move on quickly to the next person. Sorry, Dominic. Is Gil Lederman there? She wants to ask about.
Yeah, I'm here.
Yep. Hi.
Turn on my video.
Okay.
Hi, Gil.
Hi, everyone, and sorry for the hair. It's seen better days.
That's fantastic. You've got fantastic lockdown hair, Gil.
Yeah. So a question about the potential for anarchism. Does the urgency of the climate emergency change anything about it? I mean, even if, sure, we could manage ourselves just fine under normal circumstances, these are not exactly normal circumstances. We have a very short amount of time to basically rebuild the energy industrial infrastructure globally. And if there is one thing you can say for state violence, it makes things go faster. And so
in certain circumstances, and others it makes them go slower. Yeah, I mean, so you're saying that if a bunch of states decided that they were going to plant like 12 trillion trees,
something like that.
Yeah. I mean, I was talking to actually Bruno Latour the other day, and he was saying this, that like the only institutions on earth that are large enough to like actually intervene on the scale that it would take to, affect the climate crisis if they tried some techno fix are the American and Chinese armies. There's the ones of enough people under a direct chain of command. So it's not just states, you're actually talking military here. And that should be clarified because states aren't actually very efficient. And in terms of climate stuff, I mean, you have a situation which is just completely insane, right? And people know perfectly well they're literally destroying the ground out from under them, and they still seem to feel that it's unrealistic to try to save the world. Well, I mean, when that happens, you have to ask, well, what reality are they talking about? How did it happen? And wait, that's the role for intellectuals. But I don't think that states have have a pretty good track record on this one. They seem to be that which is standing in the way. It is true that something has to be done on a big scale, but I think that states will only act if they are pressured by delegitimization. And that's where anarchism comes in. If you look at, say, what ended the third world debt crisis, Latin America was like totally up to their ears in debt, and somehow that all got resolved. Well, it all happened partly the rebellion in Argentina, and I can't go into the whole history, but their slogan wasn't like, we demand you like say fuck you to the IMF. Their slogan is que se vayan todos, like to hell with the entire political class. They can all go to hell. It got to the point where politicians couldn't go to restaurants. People would throw food at them. They had to wear pony mustaches and stuff. And that's what we need to do. We need to delegitimate the political class to get them to do something, because otherwise they will not. And to do that, you need an anarchist movement. Or an anarchist.
Well, you just want to sort of like blur a raspberry in their face, or somehow kind of deflate the pomposity. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, or just make them like they can't lead normal lives. They can't. It got to the point where politicians were delegitimated as a class. They, if somebody was in a restaurant, they saw a politician, they just start throwing cake at them. So they had to do something to restore the idea that government was relevant. So they canceled the IMF debt and started a chain effect, which ultimately destroyed the whole sort of global neoliberal structure. I mean, it just completely threw into disarray for about 5 to 7 years. The IMF ended up getting kicked out of everywhere. But to make them do action on that global level is possible, but only by delegitimating them and having them have to do something to make themselves seem relevant again. Something really dramatic.
Okay, we're going to go swiftly on because everybody, we have run out of time, but so we are going to carry on because there are so many questions. We'll allow ourselves another 5 minutes. So I've got a question from Gil Thompson.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi, Gil.
David. Thank you, Tom and David, for a very interesting discussion. What I'd like to know is, post-COVID, is there anything we can learn from, when we get there, that is there anything you can learn from post-plague societies, from the research you've done? Or is it a new area of research, maybe?
That's a really interesting question. Thank you. The period right after the Black Plague was the golden age for the working classes in most of Western Europe. I always say that if you want to see how the class struggle is kind of going in any particular time and place in world history, the easiest way to check is to see how many days people had to work. Well, in the 1400s, right after the population went way down, wages went way up. There's a massive distribution. You suddenly get these sumptuary laws saying, it's illegal for peasants to wear ermine, which they really didn't have to have a law about before. And all of a sudden, like a third to one half the days were saints' days and holidays of one kind or another. But the interesting thing is that it was all thrown into this collective consumption rather than individual consumption. Capitalism only happened when they broke that. So if you read, these sort of British calendar rituals, they're usually referring to that period, which was the heyday when they had the Lords of Misrule and Habits of Unreason and the Prince of Sots and all these names for these sort of make-believe organizations, forms of governments that would kind of jump in during holidays. And they were great. I mean, I remember reading descriptions of this, and it's like, okay, on the second Tuesday after Lent, women will form marauding bands and kidnap men and hold them for ransom. And then on this day, they'll have cheese races. And then on that day, and so forth and so on. This is endless. We'll build dragons and carry around wicker dragons and set them on fire and so forth and so on. So I think if there's something to be learned from post-plague societies, it's to use our imagination to recreate society in that way. In a way, that's why everybody sort of running out to meet each other as soon as lockdown ended seemed like it could turn into that kind of a festive life. We need to reinvent what we think of as happiness, because we've got this dynamic between these sort of solitary hedonistic pleasures and this puritanical need to do more and more work to feel you justify it, which is literally killing us. We need to go the other way on both.
I think that's an incredible way to end. In fact, a lot of the questions are about economics. Mark, could you say a couple of words about that? I think that probably connects to what you've been thinking too.
I mean, the thing I've been thinking, apart from all the details and the wit, as well as the analysis from David there, is things do change. History shows us that things change radically, in fact. And that is always liberating to me, not because I want to go back, but because it feels like there's freedom to be had now, if only we can be imaginative. So I think that's one of the things I'm going to take away from what you've been saying.
Okay, Tom, David, Mark, thank you very much. And apologies to everybody who've asked really interesting questions. I'm sure you are welcome to send them in and we can ask David a bit later. So I've got them on the chat and we can ask them. But Tom, you've got a little song to play, have you not?
Oh yeah, so we're going to go out with, this is a song that was introduced to me by, where we're trying to give a good song to go out on. And I thought of Rat Race by the Specials, but that's kind of obvious. There's a sort of, there's a maybe a song that inspired Rat Race. I mean, actually, it's quite a common theme in pop songs to sort of rail against your boring job. There's a lot of them. Obviously, there's a lot in punk, Specials. But this is an earlier one by Cat Stevens. And really? This is before Teaser and the Firecats and Ruby My Love and stuff. This is a late 1960s song called Matthew and Son. I think we're going. It's a really lovely song. I think we're going. Do you know it, David? Matthew and Son. Have you heard it?
I don't actually know that. I don't.
Yeah, it's a really great song.